Coming you this afternoon. My name is Kibuitsi Machangana. I'm the director of the global programs here at International IDEA. I would like to just take this opportunity to welcome you to Stormsboro. We are still expecting a few more people, but we thought that we should start, as this actually promises to be a very interesting seminar. I would like to welcome you to Stormsboro, but also welcome you to the seminar itself. I read a bit of the background of this, and it's promising to be a seminar that will break some of our own perceptions. I mean, Latin America has always been known as a continent of high inequalities, and this seminar is promising to give us a totally different narrative and different story. So I really do look forward to this. I really want to also give a special welcome to our collaborators, Stockholm University and FAF, who have joined with us here at to do this seminar this afternoon. We at International IDEA, we always want to be the bridge between academia and policy and practice. As you know, we are a democracy building organization, and we work a lot with universities and think tanks, and we think that this is actually a very good example of how we can come together as a democracy building organization working in different regions and different countries to really bring academic analysis, academic research to inform our work and to inform also the work of others who may be here, who are interested in using this in policy work. I think with those few words, I will stop there because we are already running out of time. And once again, just say welcome to IDEA and to the seminar. Okay.
Okay, let me get my presentation.
We need to move out of here.
So we're going to get some help to get the...
Okay, so yeah.
Is that full?
That is
no, it's... Is that one? Yeah, it's the first one in there.
because it's
that one there?
no, but it's different.
That's okay. I think I'll probably manage it there.
Let me see.
It's hard to see from there.
Somebody knows how to do full screen. And that's
full screen.
Okay, while we wait, I've just been reminded of an omission I made. I would like to introduce Professor Armando Barrientos, who is the director, Brooks World Poverty Institute at Manchester University, and also Luis, not Luis, okay, sorry, Luis Henrique da Silva de Paiva. Okay, he's the former director of Bolsa Familia, Ministry of Social Development in Brazil, and associate researcher at Brooks World Poverty. They will be the ones giving us the presentation today, and Professor Olli Kangas from the Uppsala University as well. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to be invited to give a presentation on one of my favorite topics, which is the reduction of poverty and inequality in Latin America. I wanted to start by looking at this particular set of sentences, because they kind of summarize what is our kind of long-standing view of Latin America. It comes from a paper by Jeffrey Williamson, and he says most analysts of the modern Latin American economy have held a pessimistic belief in historical persistence. They believe that Latin America has always had very high levels of income and wealth inequality, suggesting that it will be hard or even impossible for modern policy to create a more egalitarian society. The ubiquitous leveling of incomes in Latin America since the 1990s appears to have done little to erode this pessimism, especially since the recent slowdown in the region growth seemed to have stunted the income leveling. And I think that the majority of the papers that I have read on the reduction of poverty and inequality in Latin America come to that particular view, that perhaps inequality and poverty are in the DNA of Latin America, and we're never going to be able to move away from it. And so I want to, first of all, tell you about the recent trends in poverty and inequality in Latin America, and then hopefully say something against this particular pessimism. I think optimism perhaps might be the thing to do at the present time. Incidentally, I can suggest that if you're interested in the history of inequality in Latin America, have a look at this paper, because it makes the argument that the increase in inequality in Latin America has not been there forever. That it comes from a particular period in the last century when other countries managed to reduce their inequality, but Latin America didn't. So I think if you're interested in the history of inequality in Latin America, this might be a really interesting paper to read. Now, what I want to do is to basically look at three main points and questions. The first one, to say something about the reduction of poverty and inequality in Latin America, particularly during the last 2 decades. Secondly, to say something about what explanations are there for these trends. Why is it that poverty and inequality have reduced in Latin America? I think essentially it's going to be too early to come to any firm conclusion on this, but I'll try to kind of give you a sense of what are the main explanations that have been provided. And then to say something about the reduction of poverty and inequality in Latin America in the context of the social and economic and political structures of the region, which I think is perhaps the more interesting point, but the one over which we disagree. I think most people tend to agree with the fact that there has been a significant reduction of poverty and inequality in the region. I think we are roughly in agreement with what the economic factors behind this are, but we're much less in agreement in terms of what do they tell us about more transformative change in the region. So that is what I plan to do. I have 2 health warnings. One is that, of course, Latin America is a really big place, and so I'm going to try to provide a regional overview, but of course, practically for every point that I make, there will be some country that can be shown to have a different trend or perhaps a different performance at any particular point in time. So I'll try to kind of focus on the region as a whole, but of course, you know, there is considerable country variation that I don't have the time to address. And the second thing is that there is no hindsight, in the sense that the events in Latin America have, in the kind of time windows in which academics work, is very recent. And so even some of the later statistics on poverty and inequality is likely that they will be revised in the next few years. So we're working with no hindsight. I'm sure that someone doing this talk in 15 or 10 years' time might come to kind of very different conclusions to the ones that I come to. Right. It might be useful to start with some trends on poverty. The Economic Commission for Latin America provides harmonized statistics on poverty in Latin America at two levels. The first is the level of food poverty, which in Latin America is referred to as indigent. And then the second level, which is the level of poverty, roughly relates to the World Bank $2.5 a day and around $4 a day to cover a more kind of international or global comparison. Now, if you look at the statistics for the region, you see that poverty has declined significantly from the peak in the 1990s. So by 2013, poverty has declined by about 1/2 or thereabouts. What is particularly pleasing, as I was introduced, I work at the Brooks World Poverty Institute at the University of Manchester, and we are particularly concerned with people in extreme poverty in the world. And what is particularly pleasing is that if you look at the proportion of the population who are in extreme poverty in the region, there has also been a very significant decline from about 20.9, almost 21% in 1994 and 22% in 1990 to about 11.7% by 2013. So again, there has been a reduction of almost 1/2 in the proportion of the population in the region who live in extreme poverty. The trends on poverty tend to apply to all countries in the region. They all demonstrate a very significant effectiveness in addressing poverty. As we're going to discuss later on, the reduction in poverty is steeper after the year 2002, between the year 2002 and 2009, when the region experienced very high rates of economic growth. And as a consequence, as you can see, poverty declined at a faster rate during that period. And of course, the other point is whether Latin America will manage to sustain the rates of poverty with the impact of the global financial crisis. We can see in the 2011, 12, and 13 that effectively the rate of poverty reduction has continued. It has slowed down, especially in terms of the population in extreme poverty. But as I said, you know, we don't have hindsight. It's likely that these kind of figures provided by Uggla might be kind of adjusted a few points in the future. But roughly, as you can see, Latin America continued to sustain its reduction of poverty through the financial crisis in 2008. And although it has slowed down, if we try to get the same picture for inequality, it's a lot more messy than that, because effectively there is a lot of variation across countries, and I do understand that you're not going to be able to see that or identify particular countries in that picture, but you can see from that from about 2001, 2002 onwards, there is roughly a decline in inequality in the region. The inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient, the closer you are to 1, the more unequal a society is. The closer you are to 0, the more equal the society is. And roughly, as you can see, there is a kind of decline of inequality in the region, but there is a lot of variation. Amazingly enough, Costa Rica has experienced an increase in inequality, and of course countries like Uruguay have experienced a decline in inequality, and so there is kind of variation across countries. But on the whole, there is a reduction in inequality. The next picture is a clean dark picture of that. And that perhaps might be much easier to see the trends in there. Of course, what we gain in clarity, we lose in terms of the kind of rich country experience of my previous picture. Now, as you can see, if you look at 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010, there has been a decline in the Gini coefficient from around 58, 57% to 52%. That is equivalent to about a 10% reduction in inequality in the region, which is very significant. Researchers have measured different ways using different indicators for inequality, and they can roughly do the same conclusion. The difference between the gray and the black kind of bars in there is that in the black bars you have all Latin Americans put together, as if it was just one single country. So that tends to put together both cross-country inequality and within-country inequality, whereas the gray bars are for within-country inequality specifically, because they take inequality in a particular country and they weight it by the population. So basically there has been a reduction in inequality of around 10% in the region. But as I said from the previous slide, that has a lot of variation, both in time and across countries in that. Now, let me summarize those points. There has been a significant reduction in poverty. Poverty remains an issue in Latin America. Of course, the good news is that we have managed to reduce it, but still 1 in 10 Latin Americans lives in extreme poverty, and over 1 in 5 Latin Americans, perhaps 1 in 4 Latin Americans live in moderate poverty. So although there has been a reduction in poverty, it is still a very significant problem. The poverty reduction is stronger in the high growth years of 2003 to 2008, but the trends have been roughly sustained through the global financial crisis. Inequality reduction trends are more mixed by country and in time, but on the whole, if you take the region as a whole, the reduction is around 10% in the 2000s. The impact of the global financial crisis on inequality has also been mixed. As you would expect, countries that are closer to the United States had a much greater impact from the global financial crisis. So Central American countries, for example, have experienced more of an increase in inequality, whereas countries further away or in the southern corner of Latin America have managed to sustain their reduction in inequality. And the point is that there is no clear or consistent unequalizing trend in the region. So effectively, when we look at the reduction in poverty and inequality over the last 2 decades, and we're concerned now about the impact of the current slowdown in growth in the region, I think the first point to make is that in both poverty and inequality, it's hard to see an unequalizing trend. It's hard to see a rapid increase in poverty or inequality. And in contrast, this is in contrast to many colleagues, like, for example, Nora Lustig and Luis Lopez-Calva, who write on inequality in Latin America, and they kind of suggest that perhaps the redistributive momentum may be hard to sustain. So far, there has been a slowdown in poverty and inequality reduction, but the trends have not gone away. Let me move next to some explanations. How can we explain the reduction in poverty and inequality in the region? I have explained in inverted commas because I don't really have explanations for you. What I do have is correlates. What things are correlated with the reduction in poverty and inequality? I'm afraid it will be perhaps another decade before we can come to some firm conclusion as to what really caused it in the first place. I think that if you look at the literature, you find that there are 2 things that people point out, and over which there is quite a lot of agreement. The first one is that there have been a significant improvement in labor market outcomes, particularly for low-income groups. Now, labor earnings have have been compressed over the last decade and a half. And that is perhaps responsible for around 70% or between 60 and 70% of the household income inequality reduction in the region. The second factor, which is very important, is the expansion of public transfers, especially anti-poverty transfers, which, because they have ensured that the growth in the 2000s has reached the low-income groups in the population. And so the public transfers are perhaps responsible for between, say, 25 and 30% of the reduction, total reduction in inequality in the region. Those two, there is quite a lot of agreement that those two are the places where we've got to look for explanations, if I could put it this way. In terms of improvements in the labor market, as you would expect, there are demand and supply issues and institutional issues. The supply issues is to do with early improvements in education investment, which naturally are leading to much higher levels of education in the labor market, especially as the younger cohorts move through kind of the labor force. That is typically a supply explanation. The reason why wages have improved for low-income groups is because their education levels are better than they used to be in the past. There is also a demand issue in the sense that there has been an increasing demand for workers with perhaps lower levels of skill. You can imagine, for example, that the commodity boom leads to demand for workers in agriculture, which generates much greater employment opportunities in that sector where there is considerable poverty in most countries. So those are important factors. And then you have institutional factors, and in particular minimum wage, which in countries like Brazil are very, very important in setting a standard for wage negotiations, both in the formal sector and in the informal sector. So those are the factors associated with improvements in labor market outcomes. Now, in terms of the expansion of public transfers, there are two types of anti-poverty transfer programs that are come to mind. First of all, what are kind of referred to in international policy debates as conditional cash transfer programs, which are preferred to describe as human development transfer programs because they try to improve the education of children and the healthcare of families in poor households. And secondly, the expansion of pension provision. And what I plan to do is to give you a few more figures on each of them, just to give you a sense of where how credible these explanations are. Now, you have some indicators at the top which give a sense of early investment in education. So if you look at, for example, mean years of education, they increased in the 1990s by 0.8%. Of a year, and in the 2000 by 0.9%. So 1.6 years, additional years of education if you have the two decades put together. There has also been a reduction in the distribution, in the spread of the distribution of years of education in the labor force. So you have, as you can see there, a reduction of 0.038 in the 1990s and 0.35 in the 2000s, which amount to a reduction in the Gini coefficient of years of education of 0.73. If you look at public spending education, which perhaps might be the clearest kind of measure to use, you see a very rapid increase in the public spending in education for 0 to 14 years of age, for children 0 to 14 years of age. And you can see the increase there from 320 US purchasing power parity to 1,451. And there has been an increase in public spending in education too. So that kind of looks at the supply side, as it were. The next looks at the demand side. It looks at the relative wages of workers with tertiary education to workers with incomplete secondary education. And that shows the rates of decline in the premium to or the wage gap between workers with university education and workers with secondary education or less. As you can see, except for Costa Rica, which is one of the countries that has experienced an increase in inequality, there has been a significant reduction in the premium paid to these workers. Next, I want to give you some information on the public transfer programs and how they have expanded over that period. Remember that together they probably explain something like 30% of the reduction in inequality. First, some information on human development transfer programs, which go to low-income families and have a link to investment in health and education. And Henrique is going to tell you about that later on. But if you look at the region as a whole, there has been a very rapid increase in the reach of these programs to around 25% of the population in the region. 135 million people are reached with these programs. The next one is to look at the improvement in pension provision too. This is not very straightforward in terms of the design of the programs, but effectively a lot of social policy in Latin America has been directed at reaching with pensions all the people who haven't got access to a formal pension system. And that's why they are called inclusion initiatives or new inclusion initiatives. And they all come in different shapes. So in Argentina, for example, it was a relaxation of the requirements to access a formal sector pension. In Bolivia, it was a new contributory pension program that is universal for all Bolivians over the age of 65. In Chile, it was a solidarity pension that provided some additional pension for all the people who have not, who are not in the existing pension systems. So for all countries, perhaps different things, but as you can see, there has been a very significant extension of pension provision, which reaches something like 7% of the population in the region. So if you put together the human development programs with the pension extension, then you are reaching something like 1/3 of the population in the region with public transfers. Of course, the value of the transfers is much lower than the one you would expect in European countries. And that gives you an idea of what is the contribution that these public transfers do to the population in the lowest decile. As you can see, there is an increase which varies from country to country, but around 20% of the income of the poorest households comes from public transfers, which was only 7% at the start of the decade. Okay, right, so the two explanations make sense in terms of the information that I have provided. Now, I come to my third question. I've been told that there will be some kind of sort of this one. Okay, right. Now, let me sum up the main points. Basically, there has been a decline in poverty, which is associated with inclusive growth in the region and with the growth of anti-poverty transfer programs. The decline in inequality is really to do with a reduction of the skills premium and also with the impact of transfer programs. Now, the current pessimism is based on two kind of assumptions. The first assumption is that if the reductions, if the improvements in the labor market that we saw in the 2000s were due to economic growth and were due to job creation that improved the outcomes for low-income families, doesn't mean that the growth is slowed down, will lead to much weaker job creation, and might lead again to a greater inequality in terms of earnings. So that is one. The second one is the view that perhaps the region has gone as far as possible in terms of using public transfers as a means of redistribution as I mentioned, something like 1/3 of the population in Latin America are rich with public transfers. So some argue that perhaps this is as far as we can go with that. So the two avenues for the reduction of inequality are kind of closing down, as it were, in the near future. Now, I'm really concerned about this. I can see the sense of this, and I can see the points in that. But usually what comes afterwards, when you have papers that discuss it in these ways, is what you see in the following. This is a paper from the World Bank, by the way. So the World Bank says, in the near future, policymakers in the region must address the deeper causes of inequality to deliver future gains. And then you usually have a list of things, the things that the World Bank would have wanted anyway in the first place, or the things that the IMF would have wanted there in the first place. So, usually people are scared that inequality and poverty reduction are going to stop, and unless you do this, it's not going to happen. And then you have a kind of list of a wish list that comes afterwards. Now, I want to say a couple of things about that. It seems to me that pessimists are missing out on the most significant structural transformation in Latin America, which is political rather than economic. It seems to me that what is really being transformed in the region is that now the reduction of poverty and the reduction in inequality are part of a strong social contract and part of emerging institutions in the region. And it seems to me that if you factor that in, if that is the case, which I can't demonstrate to you that is the case, I have good reason to think about it, about the fact that this is the case, but if there is something valid in that view, then perhaps we need to review the pessimism and take a more optimistic view. Now, I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to have to kind of rush through the next points. But one of the kind of difficulties I find in reading the literature is that people tend to go from the reduction of labor earnings that I've just discussed to the view that this is the market that has reduced inequality. Right? In fact, a lot of the reduction in labor earnings have to do with education policy in the first place, that improves education for low-income families, or it has to do with minimum wages. So I don't see a clear distinction between, say, markets and redistribution. And the other way around, too. The human development programs are not just a matter of redistributing consumption. They are a matter of improving an investment in the health and education of children, which will have an impact on productivity later on. So it seems to me that we really need to kind of take this issue of politics seriously. And it seems to me also that perhaps, and this is, I'm kind of perhaps exaggerating my point to make the point clear, perhaps what we have had in the region is an epistemic shift. It's a shift in thinking that perhaps poverty and inequality are unacceptable. And as a consequence, you are going to have new institutions that will address it in the future, regardless of whether the economic conditions of a particular point in time are favorable or unfavorable. I've got a few points to make on this. Much has been said about the turn to the left in Latin America. And in a book by Andrea Cornea, he's done a really good job in looking at the ideological leanings of the different coalitions during the 2000s in Latin America for the time. And he's divided them into radical left, social democratic, centrist, and center right. These are spells because government is elected for 4 or 5 years. And then what he's done is to measure the inequality at the start of their cycle and at the end of the cycle. He comes to the conclusion that social democratic governments tend to reduce inequality by more than the radical left, and certainly by more than the center right. Now, an issue with this particular point is that, of course, if the political complexion of the government changes, for example, if it moves from social democratic to center right and right, doesn't mean that there is going to be an increase in inequality. At least that inequality is not going to be reduced by the same amount. Now, this is an interesting argument, but I feel that it doesn't really get to the core of the issue. It seems to me that the core of the issue is that poverty and inequality reduction can become a state policy in Latin America as opposed to government policy. Latin Americans make a distinction between government policy and state policy. Government policy is what the government of the day is committed to do. State policy is what the state is responsible to do regardless of which government is in power. And it seems to me that the change is that perhaps the reduction of poverty and inequality can become a state policy as opposed to government policy. I think you can see it in two very interesting developments. First of all, the establishments of ministries of social development in the region, and again, Henrique is going to tell you about Brazil, the experience of Brazil on this, where if the state becomes responsible for poverty reduction, there must be an institution that is charged with that responsibility. And most governments in the region have created government agencies that are specifically tasked with the reduction of poverty and inequality. And the second thing is the institutionalization. Set of pictures to show you. I'm close to my red card, which is, as you can see, I need to stop with the red card. The interesting thing is that when we consider kind of political developments, essentially with policies that do redistribution, we tend to assume that a kind of market bargaining going on there, in which kind of the poor wants more anti-poverty policies, middle classes want more, perhaps a better education, better higher university education, and so on and so forth. And so we tend to see political kind of outcomes as coming out of this particular process of negotiation. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but perhaps one kind of indication that there is more of an epistemic shift than simply a shift in the balance of political forces in the region. It is really interesting information that came from LAPOP 2012. LAPOP is an attitudinal survey, and what they did was to ask in each of these different countries whether the respondents were beneficiaries of one of the anti-poverty transfer programs. They asked specifically, are you a beneficiary of, for example, Bolsa Familia in Brazil? Are you a beneficiary of Juntos in Peru, and so on? They asked specifically for that question. And the interesting thing is that when you compare the beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries in terms of their political views, you don't see a great deal of difference between them. If you ask, for example, in terms of respect for political institutions, the beneficiaries have more respect for the political institutions than the non-beneficiaries. And if you look at whether we should support the political system, beneficiaries actually have much greater support for the political system than non-beneficiaries. So it seems to me that that indicates an element of political inclusion as a consequence of the recent reaction of poverty and inequality. And I've been given the red card, so these are my conclusions. Thank you.
Hello.
No, that's not. I think you have to go to the computer. It's on the. So let me do it. I see.
Yeah,
So
no,
that's
it's open here.
right. That one.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'm speaking, stand here because I didn't bring my presentation printed in hard copy, so it should be difficult to make this presentation seated there. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's going to be much easier to speak after this broad panorama that Armando gave us. So, when you look at what happened with extreme poverty in Brazil in these 2 decades that we are going to consider here, from the beginning of the 90s to 2013, the history is not very sensitive to the poverty line that you use. Here we have 2 poverty lines: the poverty line of 1.25 a day, and the poverty line of $250 a day, and the story is pretty much the same. Extreme poverty in Brazil went down during the 90s, but it was a one-off event. It was related to the end of hyperinflation. And later on, during the 90s, extreme poverty remained stable until 2003, and it started falling in a quite steady pace. The Gini coefficient also was very stable before 2003. We use it to say that Brazilian Gini coefficient was ECG, an electrocardiogram of a dead person in Brazil. It was very stable on 0.6. And after 2003, it started falling. There's some distortion here, I don't know why, but it's closer now than to 0.5. And it fell during this period at a quite fast pace of 0.65 percentage point per year. It didn't happen all in Brazil, as Armando said. And if you look at the detail, we will see that age and race are important categories to understand how the dynamics of extreme poverty in Brazil. In general, as in many other Latin American countries, extreme poverty tend to be very low for older people. They tend to be relatively well protected, and tend to be much higher for children especially, that's the green one, and the non-white population. With different directions for these 2 groups. When you look at their extreme poverty rate as a percentage of the total extreme poverty rate, we can see clearly a tendency for non-whites to extreme poverty rate to converge towards the total extreme poverty rate. But it just happened to children after 2005, 2006, when Bolsa Familia was in place and reached into a large number of families. So what happened during this period was basically the extreme poverty here, extreme poverty by age, it dropped from the blue curve here to the red one, but it continued to affect disproportionately children, despite the fact that Bolsa Familia helped a lot to reduce the poverty among children especially. The green curve basically represents what extreme poverty would be by age without the Bolsa Familia program. So we are going to see now the factors that are in general associated to these changes in poverty and inequality reduction. First one is demography. This demographic structure in Brazil changed a lot in these 20 years. So what happens is that not only the relative participation of children, but actually the absolute number of children decreased. And as children are much more affected by poverty, we can say that only this demographic change here responds to 1.3 percentage points of reduction in extreme poverty in Brazil. In other words, everything the same, the poverty would be reduced by 1.3 percentage points, extreme poverty would be reduced by 1.3 percentage points during these 20 years due to demographic changes. It may not appear too much, but it represents 15% of what happened during this period. So, the average number of children fell during this whole period among the poorest families in Brazil as well, not only among the better off. So, the number of children is basically, the reduction of the number of children is responsible for 100% practically in terms of what happened to household size. Okay, the second point is, has to do with earnings inequality. The Gini coefficient of earnings started falling actually in not only in the early 20s or 2000s, but in the mid of the 1990s it started falling. It's related to better levels or better distributed education. Here is the Gini of years of schooling that fell during the whole period. But as well with reduced age gaps between women and men, non-whites and whites, rural and urban population, and among workers from different regions in Brazil. The third factor that I am trying to put some light on is what happened in the labor market, especially in the formal labor market. During the 90s, the number of formal jobs increased to a rate of 2.5% per year. And this pace increased a lot to almost 6% per year during the 2000s, which means that the country created around 6 million new formal jobs here and 15 million jobs here in this period of 8 years. It's pretty much like 2 million new formal jobs per year during this period. It has to do much with the economic growth. The variation of job creation and economic growth is pretty much the same, as you can see here. In relative terms, at least, construction and mining are joined with commerce and services among the services that created more jobs. This amazing number of new jobs had a consequence. Social insurance, and broadly speaking, social security protection, reached a larger number of workers. So while during the 2000s, less than half of the Brazilian workforce was contributing to social security here, this percentage jumped 15 percentage points and reached to 62%. As social security reaches other people in Brazil that not necessarily are contributing, especially small scale farmers, overall we can say now that 3 out of each 4 Brazilian workers are protected by social security, which is that number 73% out there. These exciting numbers for short formal jobs had an impact on salaries, obviously. So salaries struggle a bit in the second half of the 90s. It's the red curve out there, but they recovered after that. But this it does not explain what happened to the minimum wage. The minimum wage increased, and it has got to do with a clear decision by these governments of this period to increase the minimum wage above inflation, especially from the 2000s onwards. And finally, the last factor is social protection. And I have to add a few words here about the importance of the minimum wage in Brazil. The minimum wage is an important reference for the Brazilian formal labor market. It's an important reference for the informal labor market as well in Brazil. But more than that, the minimum wage is the basic level for pensions in Brazil. So we are paying now around 30 million benefits in Social Security. 70% of these benefits have the level of minimum wage. So it's hugely influential because it's the basic level of Social Security as well. Brazil had, joined with the pioneers of Social Security in Latin America, quite high old age social security coverage. Pretty much everyone above the age of 65 has got a benefit, which explains, jointly with the increase of the minimum wage, why the older people are relatively well protected from extreme poverty. And a third element of social protection is that the introduction of conditional cash transfers. Conditional cash transfers were adopted in Brazil in the early 2000s. Bolsa Familia unified 4 national level conditional cash transfers in 2003. And it reaches now for 14 million families or 15 million people. It's pretty much 1/4 of the Brazilian population, costing around 0.5% of GDP. When it comes to earnings and only earnings, what we've seen from 1992 to extreme poverty is 100% explained by market earnings. But from 2002 to 2012, market could explain only 50% of what happened. Transfers explain the other half of what happened. And I have to agree with Armando here. This 50% explained by the market. There's a huge effect of the minimum wage. It's not market. It has got to do with institutions as well. Overall, during this period here, the income for the 10% poorest increased substantially more than for the 10% richest. But there are reasons for concern. The main reason is that economic growth is going down, and joined with it job creation, which has fallen in the last years. Gini coefficient continued to decrease, but at a lower pace. And in the last year, the per capita income of the 10% poorest actually decreased by almost 3% in real terms. And extreme poverty stopped falling in this last year. We can't say statistically that it increased, and we should expect data from 2014 and 2015 to see how it will behave, but the fact is that there are certainly reasons to consider. Overall, I'm trying to have an answer for the question that's posed here to us. Demography responds for roughly 15% of the 9 percentage point decrease in extreme poverty, and demography will continue to work in this path. Will continue to have an effect of reducing poverty and inequality. But obviously, this kind of trend is more perceptible in the long term than in the short term. Better distribution of education will continue to push towards lower levels of inequality as well. I'm not very sure about the reduced wage gap between women and men, non-whites and whites, etc. Obviously, a weaker labor market is a fertile atmosphere to discrimination to increase. But at the same time, I have to say that unemployment rate in Brazil in 2003 was 13%, and it increased from 5 to 6 in the last year. So I think that no one is expecting it to be around 13% again. So I would work pretty much more with the idea that we will have an increase in employment, but not too much to have an effect on the wage gaps and to revert the tendency for them to reduce. Here, in terms of job creation, Brazil created, during this period that we consider here, 1992 to 2013, 26 million formal jobs. It was from a base of 23 million jobs in December 1991. Obviously, we can't see a nice, or we can't see many new formal jobs being created in the near future. It will be a difficult moment for the labor market. And probably it's going to affect salaries as well. And to a certain point, the minimum wage. The minimum wage is obviously going to be protected against inflation. But the rules that are in place don't assure us that we are going to have a real increase in the minimum wage in the situation of recession. That's probably what's going on in the next year and maybe one more. And finally, we have the higher impact of social benefits on poverty and inequality, both due to the increase of the minimum wage and to conditional cash transfers. And here as well, I think that there are reasons for concern because the minimum wage is not going to increase above inflation, probably not. And we'll have to see if it will be possible to find fiscal space to increase Bolsa Familia above inflation as we have done in the last years. So I think that the main challenge is to recover in the short term the conditions for solid economic growth, in the short and in the long term, and in the very short term to keep the trajectory of reducing poverty and income inequality in an economic scenario that is much more adverse than we had in the last years. Thank you very much.
If you press escape, then press escape. This should start there.
first one.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank organizers for inviting me to comment on those two very interesting and important papers. My comments are to some extent based on the presentations, and to some extent I use my own imagination, so that there are questions and comments based on your presentation and some more general reasoning. I think that those papers and presentations are very important in many ways. Because very often we here in the Nordic countries think that we are giving the example to the rest of the world. And I think that this country is not the least to suffer from this kind of thing. And I think that very often we fail to target, because the model that we have here in Sweden, for example, it's hard to travel. Institutions don't travel that much. And I think that ideas travel much better than institutions. And I think that in the case that we are thinking, in this case, Brazil and Bolsa Familia especially, is a very good example of innovative way of thinking and how ideas can travel from a country to another and from a continent to another. And I think that that conditionality that you have in Bolsa Familia is very good in that way that it's tied not only to money and lack of money, but it's tied to education or participation in education, healthcare, vaccination, and it's a way of social, very important social innovation. And you showed very well what are the results in Brazil and in some other cases also in Latin America. And I think that those innovators can travel, and for many other countries, developing countries and developing economies can adapt those ideas, perhaps not temporary institutions, but some ideas. And if we then think about developing countries and developing economies and place in a wider frame of reference, we have, as Professor Barrientos showed, very good results in very many Latin American countries. For example, GDP is pretty high, and if you compare Latin America to Africa, GDP is much higher than in Africa. But on the other hand, then social inequalities and income inequality is much higher in Latin America than in Africa in general. On the good side also is a very high literature rates, and especially female literature rates in Latin America. Latin America is only is only second to Europe, so that the literature rates are higher than East Asia, Near Asia, or Africa. And for example, Professor Barrientos had very good examples and explanations why is it so. And also in Professor Paiva's presentation, in those slides that you didn't show, there are very good examples on the expansion of enrollment rates in preschool and primary school and school education, enrollment in school rates in Brazil. So that I think that also in that sense, Brazil and Latin America are good examples and innovative countries for very many other groups of countries. And also infant mortality rates are pretty low in Latin America in comparison to Africa. And also that is a very good example, and I think that Bolsa Familia, when conditionality is linked to Medicare and vaccination, it will also improve the situation. And then a couple of more specific comments, and first Armando Barrientos' presentation, what explains the reduction of poverty inequality. I was wondering, why is it so that there's a weakening skill of premiums since the 90s? One could think that if the economy is growing, in that case there's a more demand and need for educated people, and then it would imply that educational skills would be higher. 10 institutions. You said in your presentations that the countries are pretty different, but somehow you lumped in your presentation those countries together when you spoke about minimum wage discrimination and unionization and formality. So that is it a story for Brazil, or is it a more general story for all the countries in the region? And I think that the idea of politics is a very intriguing and very important one, because all institutions are political artifacts, and at the end of the day we always have politics involved in our institutions. So that I think that that was a very good and important point to take up as you did in your presentation. And then post-2008 development, you say that those countries that were more linked to the US economy, they were suffering much more, and that remind me what's happening here in Europe. So that we have great problems in the Eurozone, and those countries that are outside Europe, they are doing much better. So that perhaps there's a more general story for global and globalization discussion in this respect. And then the politics again turned to the left, as you, Armando, said in your presentation. So the question is that if there is a lesson for travelers or some idea that can it travel from country to country? Because as you said, in those countries that are more left inclined and leftist, they show more diminishing inequalities than other countries. And then a couple of questions to Professor Paiva's presentation. The role of the economic growth. It seems to be so that there's no direct relationship or clear pattern when it comes to the economic growth and poverty reduction in the longer run. And it means that perhaps institutions are here more important than the economic growth as such, as Professor Barrientos said. And then what I think is very interesting in your paper is that if you look at the situation and development of pro-poor growth from 92 to 2012, then there's a very strong growth in the first to second and the lowest income deciles, whereas the later years the situation is not that good, at least from the perspective of the lowest income deciles. So that my question is that is the role of institution changing, or is it finally so in the end of the day that the economic growth is downplaying the institutions, or is it so that those two latest years they are some kind of anomalous years and deviations from the general pattern? And then what I think was very intriguing is that Bolsa Familia, the impact of Bolsa Familia, of course, it is the largest or the biggest in the younger age groups. But as we see here, the impact is somehow transmitted to the life cycles of the people, up to the very, very old people. And in a similar way, I think that because the elderly people in Brazil, they are very well protected, the impact of their income situation will then be transmitted to the younger generations, so that there's an interesting interplay going on there. And Brazil is a very good example, and Bolsa Familia is a very good example of that. It's not only children, but it's also the other sectors in society. And then finally, as I said in the very beginning, I think that Bolsa Familia is a very good example of the innovative idea that can travel very much and very well and very wide and very far. And then finally, the question to both of you for perhaps the later discussion also, for the discussion that takes place after this meeting. Armando, you are a great fan of targeting, and also Professor Paiva, you spoke about the conditional benefits. But is it so that there are high costs of coordination and administration in those schemes? And in the case that we have the situation where we have payers and those who are living on dole and those who are living on benefits. So there will be a kind of cleavage between payers and receivers and recipients. And perhaps that, at least the European experience tells us, and very many European social scientists argue that that will create a kind of welfare backlash where those payers are not that willing to pay. But in Professor Barrientos' presentation showed that that kind of problem perhaps is not present in Brazil. But the question is that is it a question of time? And very often it happened here in Europe that those targeted administrative programs, because of those reasons, they gradually expanded to be more and more universal systems. And my final question is that which kind of trends in this respect there are in Latin America. And once again, I would like to thank the two presentators for the very interesting and intriguing, important knowledge and presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Armando Barrientos and also to Mr. De Silva de Paiva. Am I saying it right? And thanks a lot to Professor Olli Kangas for the final comments. I would now give the floor to Fredrik Uggla, just to explain the afternoon a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Fredrik Uggla. I'm Director of the Institute of Latin American Studies. We're very happy to be here. I think first we should give our panelists the opportunity to get back to the comments and questions that Professor Kangas gave. Then after that, it will be your turn, really, first, for your comments, questions and so on. This will take place after the coffee, so you will have some time to chat among yourself, to devise strategies for how to present and whatever queries you want to make. So after the answers now from Professor Barrientos and Professor Silva, there will be coffee. After the coffee, there will be general questions and answers, and after that we have a panel composed of two panelists, Joakim Palme, Prof. and Karin Metell. I will present them fully after the coffee break. And with that, I think we will conclude on a more systematic discussion, perhaps. But for now, perhaps you would like to take the floor just to get back to Professor Kangas' excellent comments, and after that, we will be
thank you very much for the comments. And I don't think I'm going to be able to reply to all of them, but I'll do my best in terms of clarifying the issues that were raised. On the comparison with East Asia, I think it's very relevant to colleagues in Africa, because there is quite a big discussion, I guess, in African countries as to whether the East Asia model or the Latin American model might be best appropriate to advancing development in the region. And you have, this is perhaps in practical terms, you have a lot of Chinese investment and aid in African countries, and you also have quite a lot of investment and support from Brazil and other countries in Latin America, but mainly Brazil, to countries in Africa. And I think it's interesting to see the kind of the differences and similarities across these different models. But I think it's a question that colleagues in Sub-Saharan Africa are discussing a great deal. The reason why the skills premium might have declined in Latin America in the 2000s, the explanation that colleagues that have looked into this give is the following: that during the late 1980s and 1990s, there was a very kind of significant structural adjustment in Latin America. Trade liberalization of labor markets, and a decline in the public sector, in the role of the public sector. So most economists agree that as a consequence of that, there was a very rapid increase in the demand for skilled workers, particularly people with university education or completed secondary education. So this process of structural adjustment could have created the conditions whereby you had a very significant gap developing between workers with high skills and workers with low skills. And the view then is that if you, as you move towards 2000, that declines because the kind of liberalization had sort of worked its way through the economies in Latin America, and at the same time you have an improvement in educational investment that led to an increasing supply of more skilled workers. So that is roughly how they kind of suggest a possible kind of clarification of this. Made the point that, and I'm glad that Olli also made the point that there is considerable variation across countries. I was trying to give a regional picture, but of course, for example, on the issue of investment in education, there is considerable variation across countries in Latin America that one would need to take on board if we wanted to kind of look more closely at, for example, sub-regions and the Andean region and the sort of Central America and so on. I think that is also an important point. The issue about the politics, I think the point that I was trying to make very quickly, perhaps too quickly in my presentation on the politics, it is that we can look at the politics in Latin America in two ways. We can say perhaps the 2000s were a decade in which you had a lot of left of center governments, and which responded to the kind of accumulated social demands from the 1990s and 1980s by kind of increasing redistribution very rapidly. So it's a kind of a response to kind of demand from those particular groups. And I think that the table that I had looking at the inequality reduction outcomes by different types of government in terms of ideology would tend to somehow say, well, you know, center-right and right governments didn't do as much in terms of reducing inequality than the other governments did. I think that there's a reasonable point to take on board, and although I'm not really sure about Andrea Cornier's social democratic, I think perhaps it would be very different from Nordic social democracy in Latin America. But nonetheless, that is the point. The point I was trying to make is that there is something which is perhaps deeper and more structural than that. If you look at, for example, the introduction of human development or conditional cash transfer programs, governments of the right and governments of the left have introduced them and expanded them. In Mexico, a right of center government expanded Progresa into Oportunidades. A left of center government has done another expansion of Oportunidades into Prospera, another name. And so you do not have a very significant difference in terms of the expansion of public transfers between right of center government and left of center government. I'd be much more inclined, and I have very little time, so perhaps you might want to question me on this later. I'm much more inclined to the view that perhaps something happened in Latin America where at least the penny dropped, that you cannot have a stable societies that are prosperous, that grow, without addressing poverty and inequality. It seems to me that makes a lot more sense to me than the kind of explanation about whether particular governments or particular time were in place. Now, the point that Olli makes is true in that it doesn't actually see how this travels from country to country. Well, it would be a much more complicated kind of exercise to kind of identify that. Why is it that if you have a slowdown in growth, you have a slowdown in inequality and poverty reduction? Well, that happens. I mean, you can have strong institutions, but when you have adverse conditions, that is what happens. And of course, you know, in Sweden, you have very strong institutions, but you have had kind of quite significant challenging conditions like 1993. Now, the question is how the institutions manage to go through those adverse economic conditions. And I think that is the big question in Latin America at the moment. And perhaps I'll leave targeting versus universalism. The only point I would say about that is that when I'm invited to Sweden, I'm a big pro-targeting person. When I go to Latin America, they accuse me of being a universalist person. So I'm probably somewhere in between. But I think Luis perhaps might have a little more to say on that. Thank you.
I thank Armando for leaving this simple question for me. But first, thank you, Professor Olli. I will try to address the question about what happened to the income of the 10% poorest between 2012 and 2013. That was the year where we actually increased the expenditures of the Bolsa Familia program. And so what might be happened is probably related to the market. But obviously, the data is based on a national household survey, so it's subject to variations. We had to have the data from 2014 to be sure about what happened. If you look at data from specific years in the previous 20 years, you can see quite a few variation, but you can put all the data together. The tendency is very clear. So let's see what happens. But it's a reason for concern. I'm not saying that the situation is dramatic, but it's a reason for concern. When it comes to targeting, I think that let's consider a few questions that you have suggested. Conditional cash transfers are a clear example of how to have a targeted program with quite low administrative costs. So we can't say that administrative costs of conditional cash transfers in Latin America in general and in Brazil in particular are high. We have computed or estimated to be something around 12–15% of the overall transfers. So it's relatively low. Much of them are related to things that would apply both to conditional cash transfers, like the cost of paying benefits, the payment system. It would apply to any kind of cash transfers. About the question of legitimacy and the cleavage between the so-called payers and beneficiaries, actually it's an interesting question because we don't have a progressive tax system in Brazil, so we can't say that the rich or the better off are paying for the benefits that the worse off are. From a substantive point of view, the discussion is much more complicated than it is in a country with a high progressive tax burden, where the richer are paying for the poorer. In Brazil, probably it occurs much less than. But the second point is that the program has got a lot of support. I think that the last number that I checked, it was in the 2014 election, 3 out of each 4 voters supported the program. Which is probably one of the highest rate of approval for all the Brazilian policies. And it was advocated by all the relevant presidential candidates. And so I think that the program counts and has now a lot of support in the Brazilian society. If there is a trend to more universalism, I think that the main problem with the overall social security system in Brazil and in much of the Latin American countries, or in many of the Latin American countries, are not related to targeting, actually. It's related to social insurance. In Brazil, we spend 12% of GDP with social insurance and 0.5% in a targeted benefit. And consider the other program that it's always targeted social assistance benefit. Summing everything up, we have 1% of GDP, 1.2% of GDP. So overall, I think that targeting has a quite small space in Brazilian social security structure. And the main problem with us, at least, is that social insurance tend to protect only those that have a formal contract in the labor market and leave a lot of people unprotected. And we are spending a lot of money with this kind of benefit. And so I would say that if we were going to go to a more universalist approach, we should do it with those 12%, 12.5% that we are going to spend in social insurance, and try to make it a more universal scheme than to try to modify a team-time program that is going to exist anyway to address the poorest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there's certainly a lot of stuff for continued debate. I won't give you the time to come back now because it's overdue coffee. But please, come back after coffee with questions, with queries, and you'll have a chance to post them ahead of the overall panel debates. So I think if we try to come back at 10 to 4, that will be sufficient time for everything. And the coffee's over there. Thank you very much.